Should we get started?
Yeah, you should get started.
Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Yeah, okay, great. Hello, my name is Fedorenko and I study language in the brain. And today I'm going to take you on a journey to a particular brain, but first I'll do some very general intro. And I should say it's a real pleasure to be here to celebrate Dan's life and career. So thanks for having me. So let's start with like a 5-minute summary of 10 years of work on human language in the brain. So we've long known that there is a set of frontal and temporal areas in the left hemisphere that are important for language. At this very moment, those areas are hard at work in each of your brains as you're understanding what I'm saying. How can we find these areas using tools like brain imaging, like functional MRI? Well, I can have you read or listen to some sentences and some control stimuli which look or sound similar to language but lack linguistic structure and meaning. And brain areas that are more active when you process language compared to these control stimuli presumably have something to do with language comprehension production. We call these kinds of tasks language localizer tasks because they help us find or localize your language areas. Here are language systems of just 6 random individuals, not Dan yet. I'm showing you here the left side view of the brain, so if you just took the skull out, like that's the view you would see with, sans deactivation. And as you can see, again, the system consists of some frontal and temporal areas. They're broadly similar across people, but you may also notice that there's quite a lot of variability in the precise locations, sizes, and shapes of these areas. Some of that variability is meaningful, as I'll talk about at the very end. And this variability is why I've been advocating for almost 15 years now the importance of identifying these areas in individual participants as opposed to averaging brains together, as is commonly done in brain research, which introduces a lot of blurring and information loss. So the system has a few properties. I'll just mention them very briefly. So one, as I already alluded to, the system supports both language understanding. So for example, when we listen to speech or read text or watch somebody sign, if we're talking about sign languages, but they're also active during language production. For example, when we're speaking like I'm doing right now, or writing or signing. And the fact that the system works during both understanding and production suggests that it likely stores our representations of language knowledge, a set of meanings between forms like words and constructions and their associated meanings, semantic meanings. And of course, we can use these mappings to both encode thoughts into linguistic utterances and to decode meaning from others' productions. Second, it appears that the brain infrastructure for language is similar across diverse languages. So remember, I showed you 6 different language systems of 6 individuals. This is one of them. This is a native speaker of English. In fact, most of what we know about the brain basis of language comes from studies of English speakers, some Dutch and German and a handful of other languages, but the predominant language of interest has been English. And yet, as it's already been mentioned, 7,000 languages are spoken and signed across the globe. And the question is, do they all recruit the same system in similar ways? As a first step, we undertook an effort to try to collect data on kind of as many languages as we can manage within a time frame that's still consistent with people's career trajectories. So we developed localizers for 45 typologically diverse languages and collected data from native speakers of those languages. We found that the language systems look quite similar across all of these languages. They end up in similar parts of the brain, and they show similar properties to the ones that have been reported in native English speakers. These are individual maps, so there's some differences that you'll see, but importantly, it turns out that differences that you find among speakers of different languages are actually similar to the differences you find among speakers of the same language. So it's more about inter-individual differences rather than cross-linguistic ones. Another important property of this system is that it's exquisitely selective for language processing relative to diverse perceptual, motor, and cognitive tests. So this system is largely silent when you're doing math, solving logic problems, listening to music, think about what other people are thinking, process other communicative signals like facial expressions or gestures, and so on. And this selectivity suggests that these areas likely respond to some specifically linguistic features. Well, what are those features? Well, obvious candidates are some version of syntactic structure building and retrieving meanings of words and constructions. Some older theorizing has suggested that these two aspects are separate in the mind and should be spatially distinctly represented in the brains. It turns out the answer is not. So you may have heard claims that there is something like a syntax area, maybe Broca's area is a syntactic hub. That's not true. In fact, some of this work is summarized in a paper from a couple years ago, but briefly, if you use the right kind of rigorous methods that we've been advocating, it turns out that every part of the language system every neural population you sample turns out to be very strongly sensitive to both syntactic structure building and word meanings. There's just no such thing as a syntactic region or a syntax cell or neural population. Okay, 10 years, done that. Okay, so now let's dive into a particular language system for Man of the Hour. And this work would not have been possible without, in fact, this work was done by Maya Taliaferro and Hope Keane. I'm just here presenting what they've done. So they developed, in a very short span of time, tasks to probe Dan's brain, collected the data, and analyzed the data. And I'll tell you what we found. So we asked 3 questions. First we asked, well, does Dan actually know Piraha? Who knows? He says he does, but like nobody else other than Karen can attest to it pretty much. Then we asked whether Dan knows Piraha at a native-like level. And then we asked whether Dan is a real polyglot with all those languages he allegedly knows. So, so let me first say a couple more words about what we generally know about bilingual and multilingual processing in the brain. So one important bottom line, which may differ from what you've heard, but again, this is what's actually true. Your second, third, fourth, and so on languages, they're all processed in the very same system as your native language. Like this is just empirically happens to be true. Like I would be perfectly happy to find something different, but that's actually true. This is just 4 sample speakers who are bilingual or multilingual, and so there's 4 columns, and for each of them I'm showing you 2 sample activation maps from 2 of their languages. And again, as I've already made that point before, you can see some differences in where exactly these little blobs are across the 4 columns, but I want you to appreciate the similarity between the top and bottom images within each column, right? So you find the very same system being engaged by contrasts that target different languages within a speaker who has multiple languages living in their brains. Okay. So now we're finally getting to Dan. So here's Dan's response when he processes English. It's a very beautiful language system, if I may say so. Very nicely, strongly left lateralized, as in most individuals. So do we see the same areas show up when Dan listens to Piraha versus a control condition? So first, of course, we had to develop this language localizer for Piraha. Dan has hours of recordings from the whatever 30-plus years he's spent living with the Piraha, so he kindly shared a bunch of those, and we just selected a few short clips. They sound I'll just play you a sample clip in case, for those of you who haven't heard Piraha, it's a beautiful language. It sounds like this. Okay, so Dan probably knows what they said. Maybe Caleb knows. I have no idea what they're saying, right? We just like get those clips from them. And then the control conditions, which we commonly use for auditory language localizers, are created with a method called speech quilting. You basically take the speech signal, divide it into small segments, and rearrange it in ways so that there is no sharp artifacts that you sometimes get from splicing to kind of soften the connections. And so it sounds something like this. So if you measure the acoustic properties of those, they're very similar to speech, but you can't discern any content from speech. Okay. And so here's how Dan's brains to Piraha looks like, to Piraha relative to a control condition. So as you can hopefully see, we see very similar brain areas that are also active when he understands English. And I should note, of course, it's not a shocker, but this is the first ever recorded response to Piraha. But does it actually depend on understanding the language? Like maybe if I scanned any of you guys, you would also show some response to Piraha. I don't know, we don't know, right? This is only like N of 1 so far. And so here's again showing Dan's data for English and Piraha. And then we additionally tested the control participant, let's call him TG. And this is his response to English, which looks very typical, like, again, a very nice language system. But when he listens to Piraha, you mostly find responses in the auditory area. So for reference, this is where primary auditory areas fall. So this is primary and secondary auditory cortex, along with some other blobs. I should say that this participant had some exposure to piraha, so maybe he could actually understand a word here and there. I'll show you the data in another way, which will help interpret this further. So this is now looking in the language areas that we can find using a portion of the English data. So we find in Dan's particular brain the little bits that respond more to English compared to the control condition. And then we look at the magnitude of response, how much activity we see for English versus the control condition. And you see there is a nice big difference. So then we can ask, relative to that English baseline, how much activity does the piraha elicit? And you find a very similar level of response for piraha compared to the control condition. In contrast, if we look at TG's language areas, we find a nice strong response to English, but we find that the response to piraha is much lower. You see that there's still some response relative to the baseline. So again, maybe he could understand a word here and there, I don't know. But the magnitude of the response is about half of the response to English compared to Dan's brain, where it's the same. Okay, so it seems that Dan knows piraha, but does he know it at a native-like level? Well, how would you know with tools like this? There's two kind of neural signatures that you could use. One is this level of response that I already showed you, which is similar for piraha to Dan's native language, English. But there's another really cool signature of native-like proficiency, and this is a response in a different system, which is a system that is sensitive to general cognitive effort. So this system works when you're kind of struggling to do something. The kinds of contrast that load on the system are things like working memory, inhibitory control, attention. They're all associated with the system. It's a pretty important system in your brain. It's very extended. Like the language system, parts of it live in the left frontal lobe, but as we showed across dozens of studies, it's very sharply distinct from the language system. Functionally, it responds during diverse demanding tasks. Like I said, it's modulated by effort, so the harder your brain works in a particular task, the stronger the response. And the system is also linked to something like fluid intelligence or ability to problem solve or reason flexibly about abstract relations. So in recent years, we have looked at the responses in the language areas, which I was just talking about, and these effort areas, to languages of different proficiency. So we took a bunch of polyglots who know different languages to different extents, so they can understand them more or less when they listen to excerpts from them. And you find that in the language areas, you find a pattern where the native and like high proficiency languages, which are the two purple bars, elicit a strong response. Languages that are related to some languages you know elicit a lower response. So this is like if you're a proficient speaker of French listening to Italian, maybe you'll understand bits and pieces here and there, but the response is less. And then unfamiliar languages, the salmon-colored bar is lower still, and the low-level speech control is in gray quilts. If you look in the effort-sensitive areas, you find a very different pattern. So overall, the response to auditory language auditory stimuli in general is quite low in that system. But importantly, you find that the strongest response is actually to languages where you can understand a little bit, but not too much. So you kind of have to struggle to get meaning out of the signal. And the native language doesn't elicit a response above this very low-level baseline, like looking at a blank screen. So if you wish, native language processing is effortless. Okay. So we can look in Dan's these cognitive effort areas, and this is a response to just a demanding task, which we often use to find these regions. And you find nice, strong responses with a stronger response to a harder condition. This is a response to English when Dan is understanding English, and it's at 0. And it's similarly at 0 when he listens to piraha. So he does not engage any general cognitive effort to understand the language. So great. So Dan knows piraha at a native-like level. So finally, does Dan have the language system of a polyglot? Okay, so Dan is one of those linguists, as you already heard, who actually speaks many languages. So in addition to English and piraha, he speaks Portuguese and Spanish fluently, and he has some proficiency in Dutch and German and a little bit of French and Russian. He can read ancient Greek, you know, like as one would. Okay, so a few years ago, we got interested in the question of whether brains of individuals like that, who acquire multiple languages, are somehow different. Their languages are somehow different from individuals who are not like that, like most of us, like bilinguals or, run-of-the-mill, monolingual, bilingual speakers. To ask the questions, we examined brains of 17 polyglots and a bunch of controls. So again, these are just sample language systems in some non-polyglot individuals. And we found quite surprising to us at the time that polyglots tend to have smaller language systems. So again, if you wish, their systems work more efficiently. They don't need to recruit as much neural tissue and engage it as much when they process language. And you can show this in a different way. And this is, again, you probably can't see this, but so this is, there's a little pink dot here. So this is Dan's language. And again, this is polyglots. A different set of polyglots now on the right in purple and controls in the gray. And so Dan's language system is actually quite small. But like I said, size is not always the most important thing. And so in conclusion, Dan knows Piraha at a native-like level, and he has his language system shows a signature of highly efficient language processing that we see in either polyglots and hyperpolyglots. In conclusion, Dan is awesome, and thank you, Hope and Kim. Yours, and then Josh.
Why did Dan show more activation than TD?
For Piraha? Because he understands it more. So the response in the language area seems to scale with how much you can get out of the signal. Okay. Yep.
Hi, Josh Hartshorn. Mm-hmm. This was awesome, but you forgot to answer a really important question, which is, was Dan born a hyperpolyglot? Right? Was
That's
his
a great
brain
question,
always
yes.
more efficient?
Yes.
Because I just know I've spent a lot of years failing to learn all kinds of languages, and I suspect my language system looks different.
You know, this is a great question. I mean, this is a question that actually got me interested in polyglots in the first place. Are they born like this, or is it just like some kind of practice effects? And of course, to answer this question, you would want to test people longitudinally or do some genetic analysis. So we're actually collecting DNA samples from polyglots. I don't think we've done Dan's DNA yet, but it's going to be a few years, like probably 10, 15 years until we have enough samples to do any genetic stuff. But we are hoping to maybe do some longitudinal work with kids who seem to be into learning languages and keep adding languages. And so we can kind of see how things change over time and whether there's something different from the start already. But a very good question.
Nope. No. Hold on. Let's try again. Uh-huh. Please do. No. Woo. The suspense. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Ted and Ev, thanks so much for organizing. I'm so delighted to be here. So Dan was my first and only linguistic professor. I took with him exactly 1.5 courses. I can tell you why half. Nonetheless, he really profoundly influenced my thinking. Dan has changed over the years, right? So did I. But I think that the big questions that drive us have not changed, and I think they probably drive each and every one of us in the room. The question is very simple, right? Why us? What is the basis for the human capacity for language? The options on the table are also pretty clear, and one attributes language solely to domain general mechanisms, and another postulates a partial contribution of innate knowledge of language of UG. Now, we are scientists in the room, right? We know what to do. All we need to do is roll up our sleeves, go to the lab, and we should be able to find out, right? Except for once we start talking about that, no matter what side of the debate you stand on, we know what happens. And in this talk, my goal is to ask why that's the case. Why is language such a hard problem? Now, I don't think the problem is in the question. I don't think it's just about innate knowledge of language. I don't think it's just scholars who are struggling. In fact, every time I start my psychology of language class or just go to a cocktail party and tell people about the idea of universal grammar, that's what you get. Innate knowledge? Seriously? It's not that people reject all forms of innateness, right? People have no troubles if you ask them to assume that seeing is innate, that grabbing is innate, that emotions are innate. But as soon as you raise the possibility of innate knowledge and beliefs, innate epistemic states, they really kind of look at you. I know because I've asked, I spent my last 6 years or so looking at this question, and people really don't like the notion of innate knowledge, and it's not just about language. So in one way of doing that, we invited people to play scientists. We asked them, what do you think newborns know? And what we did is presented them with detailed descriptions of published infant research along with the rationale and method, and asked them, tell us what infants would do in these situations. The advantage is that we know how infants respond. This is a fact. And we can ask people to see if what they would say, the rationale, our rationale being that if those traits are innate, then they could show up in infants. They may not, but they might. So what do infants say? What do people say? So for example, we presented them with a description of the Izzard paper on number cognition that was done in newborns, and we told them, researchers wanted to know whether newborns have an abstract representation of numbers. So in the experiment, they presented with a certain number of sounds and a certain number of lights, such that the number is either congruent or incongruent. And we told people, well, if infants can represent abstract number, then when the number is congruent, they should look longer. So now tell us, will they look longer, yes or no? Simple question. In the same way, we ask them, will they prefer syllables like blog to bog, or will they prefer helpers to hinderers? All this was done. We know that infants can do that. 2 of the cases are in newborns. And yet, when we ask people, they just say, no way. Except for when you ask them about emotions, say, so newborns, do they prefer happy faces to angry faces? Here, the science says no, they can't do it, at least not at birth, and yet people are convinced they can. So the way these data look like, to give you a sense, for emotion, 80% say yes, infants will do that. None of the epistemic capacities seem likely to them, and in fact, for number cognition and morality, they plainly say no, because this is well below chance. You get the same regardless of how you ask. If you ask them explicitly about innateness, if you ask them what happens in a desert island scenario, what happens in split birth scenario, what happens about the traits of adults and infants, animals, and aliens, in all cases, the answer is knowledge, no, it can't be innate. Now, why that's the case? A priori, there could be many reasons for why people might respond in this way. Perhaps they don't know better. Perhaps it's their own learning experiences that mess them up. Or perhaps people are concerned with the social implications of what happens if some of our capacities are innate. Each of these proposals could well be right, and they each have something to contribute, except for what they fail to do is explain the selectivity of the bias. So why is it knowledge specifically that people deny? So here is my proposal. And what I suggest is that blindness to innate knowledge arises by design. It is rooted in core knowledge systems that are likely innate. There are 2 suspects in crime. One is intuitive dualism, another is intuitive essentialism. Each of them has a very known criminal history in human cognition. What has not been noticed, however, is that they're each incompatible with the other, such that when they combine, they really collide to give rise to a cognitive storm. Here is how the storm arises. So when we come to think about what is innate intuitively, it's known that people invoke essentialism. So what's innate lies in our essence, and that essence lies in the body. There is evidence to suggest that this is really the case. The problem, however, is that we think about knowledge, we assume that knowledge is outside the body because we are also intuitive dualists, and we think that the mind is separate from the body. And since what's innate must be in the body, and since knowledge ain't there, knowledge can't be innate. It's simply in the wrong place for us intuitively for being innate. Why do we arrive at these conclusions? Why this happens? Well, it's unlikely that dualism and essentialism are directly innate. There is no advantage for being a dualist selectively. Nonetheless, we know that these principles emerge spontaneously across cultures, even when there are very limited opportunity for cultural transmission, and that opens up the possibility that they are, in fact, rooted in core knowledge systems that, in turn, are likely to be innate. Paul Bloom has long time ago suggested how this might happen for dualism, at least. And we know that dualism is, in his proposal, rooted in two systems. One is theory of mind, another is intuitive physics. So theory of mind is the system that people use to reason about the minds of others. So if you wonder, why am I reaching my hand to the mic, you might say, well, maybe she wanted to sound louder or something like that. So you are reasoning about my mental states. The problem is that when you assume that this mental state made my arm move, the mental state is not visible. So there is no direct contact between the cause and my arm. But you have intuitive physics that tells you that objects can only interact by contact, and my hand is an object like all others. So how this is possible, you ought to experience a dissonance, and as a result, you might think that maybe mental states are kind of exempt from the laws of physics, and this is how dualism arises on this story. Now, this actually makes a testable prediction, right? Because if theory of mind begets dualism, then you would expect that if your theory of mind is not so strong, then your dualism won't be either. And if dualism in turn begets empiricism, then that should further get down the line consequences to empiricism. So your empiricism should likewise be attenuated. Now, we know where you can find those cases, and one is autism relative to neurotypicals, and the other is within the neurotypical population. It is well known that on average, males are better than females. I'm not very good at theory of mind, but on average, that's the case across cultures. So we figured, let's test it, and this is exactly what we found. In both groups, we found males and people with autism weaker dualism, weaker empiricism, and a correlation between theory of mind and empiricism. So these results suggest that blindness to innateness could very well arise by design, as Lila Gleitman has long suggested. Maybe empiricism is really innate. So what does this all tell us about universal grammar? Is it really possible that linguists are biased and we all suffer from this? Well, we might, right? So if people are biased and linguists are people, they could be biased. But whether this is in fact the case is very far from clear, right? We don't know that linguists are in fact biased. We don't know that if they were biased, is it due to intuitive psychology? None of them is even remotely clear. And we certainly can't determine whether UG is right. So all those questions are very much open. Everything that I'm going to say from now on is my impression personally with no scientific validity whatsoever, just talking between friends. And I can only share with you my impressions trying to do phonology in this current climate, and tell you about a case that I've explored extensively and what I see is going on in the field from my very personal perspective. So I looked at syllable structure. Why is it that we blog rather than blog? I think the facts are pretty clear. As far as the human facts, the linguistic facts, typologically, blog is far more frequent, no question about that. Also well established that people show this preference regardless of whether one or both are attested in the language. In fact, newborns do the same. So the fact that linguistic behavior favors blog is pretty uncontroversial. Fact number one. Fact number two, the body, let's call it, right? What happens when you look at the sensory motor system? Here we saw another fact, which is indeed, blog is harder to say, harder to hear. So there are obviously two issues that needs to be considered. What's the link between the two? And this is a question that one would expect to explore actively. There are several positions on the table. There is one that says that yes, the sensory motor system is a direct cause of human behavior, as you see it in typology and experiments. But it's certainly not the only possibility. And one other alternative is that the horse that drives the language preference is universal grammar innate knowledge, except that UG is not arbitrary. Rather, it is optimized, it is designed to optimize in ontogeny and phylogeny those sensory motor pressures. Possible, right? So one would have expected that in light of that, there's going to be active research in phonology trying to ask A, is it sensory motor or phonology? B, how those things are related? And 3, how are those related to UG? And you rarely find those discussions. Instead, what you find is that people pretty much assume that model 1 is the only possible answer. And there are reasons to consider that maybe that's not right. We know that first, the sensory motor and the phonological systems are very different. One is analog, the other is digital. We know that some phonological principles are not only digital, but they in fact amodal. So in a line of research, we've shown that what you know about English will spontaneously project to signs in ASL, even if you've never seen ASL in your life. You spontaneously project those phonological principles to the phonology of sign, which suggests that those principles must be amodal. And the third evidence comes from dissociation, say in a recent TMS paper in which we found that the phonetic systems relies on the motor system. This is well known from many studies. We found that the same even compared to Broca's area. But phonology, specifically the syllable hierarchy, is more reliant on Broca's area, specifically the part triangularis, even when compared to the motor system. So there are reasons to believe that the story on the left is not the only one that's right. Why do people jump to this conclusion? Why this is so popular, I don't know. Intuitive psychology presents an explanation. So if you ask why UG is so hard, I think the answer lies in core knowledge. And it's not just UG that suffers from core knowledge. You see it all over in science and education. So why is gravity hard for kids to figure? Well, it violates core physics. Why is natural selection difficult for kids to get? It violates essentialism, right? If you ask why is UG, well, maybe it's for the same reason. Maybe it's hard because of our core knowledge. What can you do? Well, looking within is just such a tricky business. Perhaps awareness to our biases, no matter what side of the debate you're standing on, might help us prevent them. And thank you, and thanks to Dan for being a good mentor.
Adele Goldberg, thank you. It seems among linguists that the idea of universal grammar was extremely popular. They had no trouble accepting that, endorsing it, and making it beloved. And so maybe after 50 years, the answer as to why we no longer accept it, at least many of us in the room, is because there's no evidence for it.
Well, this is not what I see in phonology, and this is not the kind of biases that I see in phonology. So I should say there are many reasons for, so if there are many reasons why people, the debate is difficult, and it's not just psychological bias. There's certainly, as we saw today, lots of personality biases that are coming as well. I can't speak to the state of affairs in syntax. I must confess I don't know this literature. I do know what's going on in phonology. I don't see this debate even remotely being handled in the way it should be.
We need a mic. There's a lot of people on Zoom. Sorry for the delivery process. It's okay. And please identify yourself.
Sure. I'm András Kornai, and all I want to say here is that phonology is very different from syntax. In phonology, I think the evidence is incontrovertible that yes, there is universal grammar, there's universal preferences. There is actually mountains of literature that point you towards some kind of universal phonology, if you will. And you don't have these mountains of evidence in syntax. To the contrary, there seems to be, the closer you look, the more it evaporates.
I think that if you talk to most US linguists or phonologists, they are not going to endorse this conclusion, and they're going to state that to the extent universals exist, they are phonetically based. In fact, the very question of, forget UG, just looking at the grammar of a language, the question of whether causes of linguistic preference are phonetic or phonological are rarely examined systematically. Many people just plainly say, I don't care to make a distinction between them. For me, this is very concerning, even putting the innateness question.
Can I ask one last question?
Yeah, keep the question.
Yes, sorry.
While we're making the change, just a small one. How do you define knowledge?
A small question.
I don't, it's a good point. I do not, so very good point. I did not mean to draw a distinction between knowledge and belief. So I use knowledge collectively to encompass all epistemic. So in fact, I talk about epistemic states as opposed to knowledge and belief as distinct from each other. So everything that you know and believe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please go ahead, Sascha.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sascha Griffiths. I have the great, spot right before lunch, so I need to be quick because everyone will be going, when is this guy going to finish? So I changed the title of my talk actually slightly, and I called it Dan's Field Research, How to Change a Mind. Just now I had to think of, there's a TV show called Ted Lasso where they make this joke where the American football coach takes over a British Premiership team, and the captain is really furious about the approach that he takes, and when he leaves the room, the others go, well, he's angry now, wait till we win him over, then he'll really be furious. And that's kind of what happened with Dan and me. And a really interesting thing here is, and the talks today partially reflect that, is that, don't read all that, I'll summarize it in a moment, but it's a really great joke here. In that cartoon, we had it in the last department that I was in, where I was teaching research methods, actually. Oftentimes, people will say, I love science, or I love math, and what they mean is a particular fact about something they've just learned about how, stars move, or something about the brain. So they're talking about research findings. And one of the things it states here, which I find really good, is you seem to not understand the words love and science here. And the punchline in the end is, you don't love science, you just like looking at science's butt as it walks past. And that's sort of how I see the relationship between Dan's methods and the research findings. So a lot of people, after cultural constraints on grammar and Piraha, were discussing the results. Does Piraha have no colors? Do the people count? Things like that. But the people who really influenced me taught me science is more about method than about the findings. The findings are only, in the Popper sense, relevant until they're falsified. Yeah. and science is more a state of mind. So I'm going to compare three things here. One is a fictional case, which is the movie Arrival, which I actually like. I think Dan wasn't a big fan, but only because of the conclusion it drew, not because of the methods shown in it. And I actually think they're quite similar to how Dan describes his methods. And then there's my own research in the village of Wumyari in Cameroon. I'm going to be really brief, like, on all of these. And then there's, well, Dan Everett's research on Piraha. So my own field research, this is kind of also the story how Dan and I came into contact. Was 2008 to 2009. I went to the central northern part of Cameroon. You can see like a pin there. That's where the village of Umyari is. There was no like Google Maps location for this. I put that there. We had to actually, drive around in a truck for quite some time to find the village. We were like circling in on it. Wawa is a Mambiloid language spoken in Cameroon by approximately 3,000 people. Might be going down, might be going up. We never know with endangered languages, because people still have kids, and while the sort of like active speaking part of the language might be shrinking, the population might still be growing. And there are several publications, including my PhD thesis, which is the first thing there, which describe this. And I was particularly interested in a question, complexification versus simplification. And so I was wondering, before a language dies, does it get more complicated or less complicated? Dan has often mentioned this society of intimate ideas that Jevon talks about. And this is, most languages that are spoken will become an extreme society of intimates language before they die out, only spoken by a small crowd that gets smaller and smaller every day. Like Robson, who I wrote that one paper with, there was one speaker left, and there were kind of only semi-speakers otherwise, and it only had traditional things. But the interesting case of Wawa was that there were no traditions left. Like the language was the only marker the people had for saying what they were, because they had Fulbeyized. The Fulbe people surround them, and they had completely converted to Islam and taken on their culture. So the big question was, why is their language still there? So I wrote a thesis. You might see where this is going, colors, numbers, things like that, things that are easily testable. And I had to do it mostly in a monolingual way, because I suck at French. And I just realized that again on the Air France flight, where they speak mostly French, and I was like, I don't even get what they're talking about. I've been learning French for 20 years, and I still have no clue what the pilot says when we take off. And that's really, can you study my brain? There's something wrong with me in French. Portuguese, Spanish, French doesn't work. So right before I began my PhD, David Gibbon had to write a report on my master's thesis, and in the final paragraph it said something about me accepting the Chomskyan framework a little too uncritically. Yeah, so when I now started preparing for fieldwork, I came across this name all the time, Dan Everett, who has been described as a great descriptive linguist, but otherwise a charlatan. Well, okay, I was thinking the same thing, but here's where the story begins of, how I was won over. So I was sitting in Cameroon with no clue how to do this, and I got a hand on a PDF that was circulating amongst PhD students at the time, Fieldwork by, I'll have it on the screen later, which was a manuscript that Dan had written, and the PDF was circulating, and everyone was going, if you're a field linguist, you should read this. And I was starting to read this, but I was, like I said, I was getting really angry about some of the things, which was completely unnecessary. So I wrote Dan an email at some point, and he did the sensible thing. He replied very kindly and just attached 3 papers. One was the one by Mike Frank and Ted and others on numbers. The other was by Peter Gordon, and the third was by Jeanette Sackel and Eugenie Stuppert on monolingualism, which was exactly the question. I was like, so how do they have a word for whiskey and things? That was actually my question. And so I had to answer the question myself. At the same time, I was stuck with these like I literally took one of these books to the field with me. Like I was really getting interested in empirical research, empirical claims, and I took methods in cognitive linguistics with me, and there was no chapter on fieldwork there. And I was going, how am I going to do this? I can't take an fMRI with me. I doubt that eye tracking will work, as Tecumseh Fitch also tried with PIRA. And I don't have like supercomputers with me because there was also some bits on computational modeling. But Kuzna's book actually has 6 criteria. So it's not about the fancy equipment you use, it's about the mindset you apply. So science is empirical, science should be systematic and explicit, science is logical, science is theoretical, explanatory, and predictive. Science is based on testing. I removed something, that's why the in isn't ungrammatical. It made sense if you don't omit the bit that I omitted. And science is public. And this is exactly what I wanted to talk about. So if you look at the monolingual field research method as described by Dan, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, it's all about, you know, as Sampson says, look and listen. You go to a place where the people speak a language. That's also an arrival. They want to show her some recordings in the film. And she says, I have to talk to these people directly. And that's basically what fieldwork is about. So it's really empirical. You go to a place where people speak a language and perform your research there. You rely on direct interaction with speakers, which Dan actually uses the word teachers. Most field linguists use words like informant, which kind of sounds like you're, you know, snitching on someone. Or participant is used more in the, but Dan in his work calls them teachers. And the basic thing is you pick up natural objects. That's kind of core to the way that Kenneth Pike and Dan Everett describe this. You use sticks and stones. I wanted to make a Rihanna joke there, but won't do it in the interest of time. And you show it to people, and you rely just on your own language. So this is how things changed for me. So I'd wasted 6 months in the field, then came across Dan's 2001 paper, which describes the method in a lot of detail. And I started literally sitting down, camera, 2 sticks, 2 stones, 2 leaves, and applying the method, and within a month I was able to speak to people without any boundaries. Well, some, of course. And you can act out scenarios. You see that in the movie Arrival, for example. You see people walking, they kind of build it up. They start with this sign, human, and then they have, you know, further. It needs to be systematic and explicit. I think, you know, writing down what you did and how you came to the conclusions. I think Dan has done a lot on that. Kenneth Pike has this one unpublished manual, but I literally couldn't find any other literature than Dan Everett's work on. But there's lots of it, papers about it. And Ultra Learning actually has an interesting spin on it. That's a book for the popular masses where Dan's method is described in a slightly different spin, where the language learning part is actually in the center. Science is logical. You have an underlying hypothesis. In Arrival, they use the distributional hypothesis, or word vectors, as you can see in the movie several times. So modern deep learning methods basically are at the core of what they're doing. I used sociolinguistic typology to tie everything together. Peter Trudgill's 2011 book says more about that. Cultural constraints on grammar. Dan's underlying hypothesis was culture ties it all together. Science is predictive. In the movie Arrival, that's kind of like a nice spin that she has this book, Universal Language, which actually ties all of what they're doing together. I used things like Berlin and Kay's color work, for example, as, you know, being predictive. What color system would you expect? Dan, as you can see in a lot of, you know, for example, the YouTube video, phonology is a solid basis, but also typological knowledge of what he did. What to expect, and then see if you can find it. Science is testing. Give weapon, that's a critical scene in Arrival. They misinterpret the statement. They're asked to ask the aliens, what's your purpose here? And they answer, give weapon. And then they, you know, I don't want to spoil the movie, but they get it completely wrong because give can be ambiguous, who gets what. And weapon, well, they get that wrong. It's actually not weapon, it's tool, but things like that. And they point out in the movie, we should test that hypothesis. This is our guess what it means. It's not the final thing. I actually tested something that the contact hypothesis, so contact with the other tribe was central. So I did a study on what is the contact between the tribes psychologically at the moment. And then, of course, we have, as I've mentioned, a lot of people claim Dan's research cannot be verified because he's the only source. That's not true. There's research on the monolingualism claims, for example, by Jeanette Sackel. There's Peter Gordon, who's published a lot, and there's actually one very funny paper in which he's quoted on, where he says, well, people criticize me for my method. Have you seen that? Like, people criticize me for my methods while I was only trying to survive in the Amazon. There's Mike Frank's paper. Caleb Everett has done. Oh, sorry, I should have put Caleb there. It was again, ambiguity. Caleb Everett's more recent research on Piraha. Science is public. I think that was, the big thing. Arrival, of course, is a movie. It promotes kind of like being a linguist. That's at least what most of us hoped. But the core thing is, in the movie, they discuss sharing the information that they gathered between the Chinese team, the Russian team, and the American. And one core failure here is that they're not exchanging the information. Documentary linguistics, that's all about making it public. So putting the data in archives where everyone can access them. And then, of course, we know how Dan shared this information publicly. He made materials available online. He's written books for the general public on this. There's a documentary. Wow, right on time. Cool. There's news and reports, Geo Magazine, the New Yorker article. There was a play in London, which I had the pleasure of attending, based on Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, but more focused on the missionary story. Accounts by third parties like Peter Ladefoged saying, I'm not sure about the claims, that's in his book, Phonetic Fieldwork. I'm not sure about the claims that Dan has made about the language structure, but they are the most unusual people I've ever met. And of course, lots of discussion. I mean, even the controversy just made it more public, that case where we have testable hypotheses. These are hypotheses that need to be tested. And these are a couple of conclusions that I just made up because I didn't know how to finish this. Languages should be studied in the environment in which they're spoken. Preparation for field linguistics should involve, knowledge of language and linguistics. That's really critical. And data and research needs to be made public. And new technologies will change this. Had no chance of speaking about that, but I just taught ChatGPT to speak a little Wawa, write Wawa in IPA, but yeah. And that's that. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's really good. I remember very well the correspondence that we had about your fieldwork. Arrival was, the original short story was based on the work of Ken Pike. And that's what inspired the movie, was Ken's monolingual method. But what sorts of problems did you encounter as most serious when you were learning the language Wawa monolingually?
Oh, that's a good question. What sorts of problems? The original procedure I did was the really boring going through word lists, and I was good at pronouncing French, but grammar just doesn't make sense. And then I had to expand the method from just sitting around. The real problem, sorry, I had to think about that question. I think the real thing is, if I were to answer, can you replicate Dan Everett's research, I would say, yeah, sure, if you have 20 years going to the jungle. In the village, the more I learned the language, the more I, had conversations with people, which then I needed more structured ways of finding out about. But in the end, the only things I reached really definitive conclusions on were things like colors, numbers, pronouns, things like that. So very simple things. I had very structured methods of testing, but then other things, for example, the recursion question, I noticed the same thing that they were not saying. So he said, he's coming later. I think those are two sentences in Wawa 2, because they don't, One explanation is they're both unwritten languages, and in many unwritten languages, there's not, embedding or whatever we want to call that. So he said, he's coming later, were definitely, according to the phonology or the intonation or whatever, two sentences, like in Piraha. But, the more you interact with people, the more stuff you would actually have to test. And, that's why I ended up with very simple conclusions.
Josh Hartshorn. So this was really interesting to think about, and I wanted to pick up on a thread that's come up in a few talks here, which is that, obviously we would love it if there was a ton of funding and support to send a lot of people out to do, 20-year field linguistics research, but we don't.
Well,
right?
It is mega churches, but still. Yeah.
So I want to pick up this new technologies, or just what you think about scale, right? So 7,000 languages, probably half of them will be gone by the end of the century, but that's gone in the sense of we won't be able to do field work anymore. It's worse if we think about psycholinguistics or neurolinguistics or language acquisition. The timeline on that is probably many of those languages already the time has passed, right? Mm-hmm. So what can or should we be doing to try to speed up the rate at which we are understanding the other languages, given what you're talking about is a very time-intensive, person-intensive work? Should we just be picking a small number of languages and that's just going to be the ones, or are there things that we can be doing to speed up this process?
That's a really interesting question, because for many people, as miserable as I was in that postmodern anthropology department that I then joined, was why is the guy here anyway if he, if he's only interested in formal linguistics, computational. And the reason was that Stephen Bird had given a talk at Bielefeld, invited by David, on NLTK and what it will mean, Natural Language Toolkit, the Python library for. And he was basically advocating for people like me, computational linguistics, proficient people, to pick up field linguistics, because that was the only way we could scale it. And I'm not sure I've arrived at a conclusion. So ChatGPT definitely starts, second round, it starts hallucinating numbers. I'm not sure we have the technology, but one point that has come up now is record the stuff. So I'm not sure whether we should pick some language, but what we should definitely do is record lots of it and find a way of pretty quickly gaining access to at least some of the structure, if that makes any sense. I mean, Stephen Bird has released something which he calls the Ikuma app, where you kind of give native speakers a mobile phone or something, and then they record part of there and kind of give you an idea of what's in there and things like that. So I'm not, because I get asked a lot about, will AI replace me in my job? I'm not saying field linguists will be replaced by AI, but I'm seeing huge potential in recording things now with proper intuitions of the kind of access to the language that we will need, and then scaling up that to, an actual documentation. But right now, I think the state is still, I have hours of recording that I'm never going to transcribe properly, because that's what they tell a young field linguist, at least, that's what I was told. Everything you don't transcribe in the field, where you still can check up on, what does this word mean, or did I get that right, you will never, transcribe in the end when you're at home, and you just record everything and you go, I'll figure it out later, and you never do. So I think the best answer I can give is I think new technology gives us the power to scale, but we need structured ways of gathering that data in a proper way. Yeah.
Thank you very much.